Okay, so you know how this works, right? You send us something you're trying to get your head around. And
They jump right in.
yeah, we kind of roll up our sleeves and do a deep dive into it, bring you the nuggets, you know, the good stuff. Yeah, the key insights, so you can really feel like you've gotten a handle on it without having to spend hours and hours digging through it all yourself.
That's right.
Because time is precious, and staying in the know shouldn't feel like a second job.
Exactly. And in this case, you know, the source you've given us is a really interesting excerpt titled 50 Advanced Must-Know English Words for Fluent Communication.
Yeah, just the title alone is kind of intriguing, right?
It is a roadmap for our deep dive.
It is. So the goal here really is to unpack some of these advanced English words, and I'm doing air quotes there because, you know, what even is advanced, right?
Yeah.
But we're going to look at them and not just give you definitions like a dictionary would, but really understand, you know, what do they mean? Why does this source think they're so valuable for sounding fluent? And also we're going to look at some of the memory tricks that they suggest, because, you know, knowing a word is one thing, remembering to use it is a whole other ball game. And the piece, you know, it really argues that mastering these kinds of words can really boost your confidence when speaking, can help you understand difficult texts more easily, and overall just give your English, you know, a more natural, polished kind of feel.
Make it shine.
Yeah, exactly. Make it shine. Okay, so let's get started unpacking the first word on the list.
Ubiquitous.
Ubiquitous.
This source defines it as present everywhere, and it gives a very good example with smartphones.
Yeah, they say smartphones are ubiquitous in modern society. I mean, it's hard to imagine life without them now, right?
It is hard to imagine.
I mean, it's true, present everywhere. It really does sum it up.
Absolutely does.
And the synonym they offer is omnipresent. And you often hear that word used, I think, in a slightly more kind of philosophical or spiritual...
A broader context.
Yeah, a broader context, yeah, suggesting a presence on a grander scale. But ubiquitous, it's interesting how it pinpoints that feeling of just something being so common that you just encounter it constantly in everyday life.
Absolutely.
And here's a clever bit. The memory trick that they suggest is to link it to Uber, you know, that ride-sharing service that feels, well, pretty ubiquitous in many cities these days, with the tail end of the word quitus, so uberquitless, to help you recall present everywhere. What are your initial thoughts on that kind of association?
I think it's a smart way to connect something that is abstract to something very real and current. I think those sorts of mnemonic devices can be really powerful because they create a personal connection to the word. It's not just a series of sounds anymore. It's linked to something that you experience in your life.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Okay, up next we have ephemeral. What can you tell us about that one?
Ephemeral means lasting for a short time. And the example that they give is that fame can be ephemeral.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah, a bit of a reality check perhaps for some aspiring stars.
Yeah.
But the synonym here is transient, which again, you know, has that sense of something passing through, not sticking around for long.
Right, transient, like a fleeting moment or a temporary guest. The memory trick for ephemeral is to kind of break it down. They say epi means short, and hemeral is like hem, as in, you know, the hem of a garment. Something small or finite, so short-lived. Again, it's about taking the word and dissecting it into smaller pieces that hopefully, you know, trigger that memory.
Yeah, and it's quite effective how it taps into potential subconscious knowledge of word parts.
Yeah.
You know, epi does come up in others meaning, you know, upon or outer.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, the association with short is what really makes it work to create that mental link to its meaning.
Okay. All right. Let's move on to a word with a rather pleasant sound. I think serendipity.
Ah, serendipity.
Yeah.
It's defined as a fortunate accident. And the example they use is finding that old book was pure serendipity.
Mm.
The synonym they give is simply luck. But it feels like it's more than just luck, doesn't it?
It does.
It's a happy discovery.
Yeah, an unexpected discovery.
Yes.
Yeah, it's that lovely feeling of stumbling upon something amazing when you weren't even looking for it. And the memory trick here is quite vivid. They say, imagine taking a serene dip in a lake, and whilst you're enjoying the calmness, you unexpectedly find something wonderful. Serene dip serendipity. I find that really sticks in my mind.
It does. The positive imagery, I think, helped to reinforce the meaning. It's easier to remember something that evokes a pleasant feeling.
So we've looked at ubiquitous, ephemeral serendipity. Already you can kind of appreciate how incorporating words like these can add a richer texture to your language, right? Instead of just saying, something's everywhere, you could say it's ubiquitous, which just sounds a bit more precise when you're talking about trends or widespread phenomena. Instead of saying something didn't last long, calling it ephemeral hints at its fleeting nature, maybe in a more poetic way. And instead of just saying you got lucky, talking about serendipity emphasizes that delightful element of chance discovery.
Absolutely. And I think they offer a more nuanced way to articulate your thoughts. And I think, as the source points out, the precision can make your communications sound more articulate and thoughtful.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit now and delve into a word that carries a bit more of a negative weight.
Pernicious.
Yeah.
It means harmful in a subtle way. And the example provided is that gossip has a pernicious effect on relationships.
Oh.
And the synonym is destructive, which certainly conveys a strong negative impact. But pernicious really highlights that slow, insidious damage that might not be immediately obvious.
Yeah, that subtlety is so important with this word, right? It's not a sudden blow. It's something that gradually erodes or undermines. And the memory trick they suggest is to break it down again. Per, suggesting through. Nicious, sounding a bit like vicious, gives you that sense of something viciously working its way through something causing harm over time.
Yeah, and that connection to vicious, I think, brings out the negative aspect. And the idea of through really underscores that gradual penetrating nature of the harm.
Now, for a word that leans towards the ideal quintessential.
Quintessential.
Yeah.
It means the perfect example, and they give the sentence, he's the quintessential gentleman.
Oh, okay.
The synonym is archetypal, suggesting the ultimate model or standard.
So the absolute epitome of something, and
Yeah.
the memory trick cleverly links quintuplets, the number 5,
Yeah.
to that idea of an ultimate, top tier version combined with essential. So almost like the 5-star essential, if you will. It just makes you think of the very best.
And that numerical link can be surprisingly effective. Thinking of quint as, representing the highest degree, the best among a set, really helps solidify that meaning. A perfect example.
And finally, in this set, we have a word that's particularly relevant when we're trying to understand information, or sometimes when information is being deliberately kept unclear. Obfuscate.
Obfuscate.
Obfuscate, yeah.
Which means to confuse or make unclear.
Right.
And the example they give is, politicians often obfuscate the truth.
Sadly, very true.
Yeah, a rather common observation, I would say.
In today's world, the synonym they offer is simply confuse, but obfuscate implies a deliberate act of making something murky or unclear. Right, it's that feeling you get when someone is intentionally trying to muddy the waters or avoid a clear answer. The memory trick breaks it down as suggesting against, and fuscate sounding a bit like darken. So against making things clear, deliberately darkening the meaning.
It's a strong image, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Actively making something darker, less clear.
Yeah.
So we've had a taste now of some of these advanced vocabulary words. You can already see how they offer a richer, more nuanced palette for our communication. But just knowing the definitions isn't enough, is it?
No, it's not.
We need to be able to recall them and use them naturally. And the source we're looking at have a whole section dedicated to strategies for doing exactly that.
It does indeed.
So what do they suggest?
So they lay out 7 key methods for making these words, really stick in your memory.
Okay.
The first one is spaced repetition.
Okay.
And they even recommend using, digital tools like Anki or Quizlet.
Right.
And this technique is all about reviewing information at increasing intervals to move it from short-term memory to long-term recall, which makes perfect sense. It's not about cramming it once you know and hoping for the best. It's about revisiting those words strategically over time.
Yes.
All right. The second technique is one we've already seen in action today throughout our discussion. Mnemonics and word associations, right?
Exactly.
Creating those vivid images or those personal feelings or those little stories.
Finding that hook.
Yeah, find a hook. The third strategy is all about putting those new words to practical use, using them in writing and speaking daily. So the source suggests incorporating them into things you already do, like writing emails, keeping a journal, or even consciously trying to, weave them into your everyday conversations. It's about that active application.
Absolutely.
Which ties back to what you said at the start, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Passive recognition, just understanding a word when you see it, is very different to active recall. Being able to pull it out and use it yourself. And by deliberately trying to use these words, you're not only reinforcing your understanding, but you're making them a more natural part of your active vocabulary.
Okay, that makes sense. And the next strategy is reading advanced material. Things like in-depth books, scholarly articles, detailed reports. The idea here is that you'll encounter these words in their proper context, which helps to solidify their meaning and demonstrate how they're used correctly.
Context is so crucial.
It is. And it also ties directly into, I think, our listeners' interest in being able to understand complex texts more easily, right?
Absolutely. Seeing how a skilled writer uses the word correctly, in a sentence within a broader argument, provides a much richer understanding than just, memorizing a definition in isolation.
Yeah, the fifth suggestion is watching TED Talks and documentaries. And it's similar to reading, but it immerses you in environments where this kind of advanced vocabulary is being used in spoken language.
Yeah.
So you get a feel for how they sound in natural conversation, how they're integrated into real-time communication.
And often the visual element, I think, in those platforms provides additional cues that further aid comprehension and memory, giving you a more holistic understanding of the word.
The sixth technique is joining a debate or discussion group, which really encourages active participation, right? It
Yes.
pushes you to use those new words in spontaneous conversation, which is the ultimate test, I think.
It is a high-pressure environment, forcing you to recall and accurately use the words in a dynamic setting.
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yes, it is where passive knowledge gets tested and transformed into active skill.
And finally, the seventh strategy is really interesting. They say teaching someone else, and they highlight how explaining the meaning and usage of a word to another person actually deepens your own understanding of it.
I think that's really true. There's no better way to make sure you understand something than having to articulate it clearly and concisely to someone else. It forces you to go beyond that superficial understanding and really grapple with the nuances.
So it's not about rote memorization or passively absorbing definitions. It's about actively engaging with these words in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
Reading them, writing with them, speaking them, even teaching them. It all comes back to the idea that consistent usage is what really makes them stick.
That is the key.
So we've taken a good look at a selection of these advanced words. We've explored their meanings. We've even delved into some really interesting, effective memory techniques. We've also looked at the source's broader strategies for actually incorporating them into your vocabulary. And it all circles back to that initial premise that a more sophisticated vocabulary can really significantly enhance your communication, making it more fluent, more articulate, and ultimately more persuasive in your interactions.
I think so too.
Now, this deep dive, it's really just scratched the surface.
It has.
This excerpt actually lists a full 50 words. Each one comes with, its definition, example sentence, synonym, and a helpful memory trick. And it lays out those 7 key strategies for truly embedding them into your everyday language.
So where does our listener go from here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the source concludes with a final challenge, and it poses some really good questions to consider. Things like, try to weave at least 10 of these advanced words into a short piece of writing, or explain the meaning of 5 of them to a friend without looking up the definitions, or take a self-assessment to kind of gauge your initial understanding.
That's a good challenge, I think.
It is, but maybe an even more manageable starting point building on that challenge is to just reflect on 1 or 2 of the words we've explored today, maybe ubiquitous or pernicious or perhaps serendipity, and just consciously make an effort to use them in your conversations or your writing at some point this week.
I like that idea.
Or you could even go and look at the full list of 50 words in the source material and pick a few that particularly intrigue you and experiment with some of those memory techniques.
The important thing is that you're engaging.
You're engaging, exactly. The fundamental principle is that consistent and active engagement with the language is what transforms those new words from a list into, a natural part of your communication.
It makes them your own.
It makes them your own, exactly. So to quickly recap in this deep dive, we've explored the concept of expanding your vocabulary with advanced English words. We've examined several compelling examples from this list of 50, and we've considered some really highly recommended strategies for not just remembering them, but actually using them effectively in your daily communication.
And hopefully that gives you something to think about.
Our mission, as always, is to help you grasp this material efficiently and thoroughly without ever feeling overloaded,
Absolutely.
If you found this deep dive particularly helpful, you might want to seek out the original source material. Explore the remaining words and techniques it has to offer. You never know what other linguistic gems you might discover that could further enhance your communication skills.
It's a treasure trove.
It is a treasure trove. Until our next deep dive, keep exploring and keep learning.
See you next time.
See you next time.